The meta is not as important as you think it is. Blindly following meta lists or snap adjustments to a change in the game can result in a worse performance. Whether we're prepping for a big tournament or just a weekly pickup game, we need to have a much more considered approach. Hello and welcome to Incursion Tactics. This week, I will be mostly talking about the meta. In particular, how paying too much attention to it can seriously impact our games. I'm going to cover off some of the key things to keep in mind when we're thinking about the metagame, so that by the end of this video, we know the pitfalls to avoid. Let's get started. The main two resources I'm going to share for information on the meta are from StatCheck and 40k Stats. These are both amazing free resources that provide tons of data from tournaments all over the world. I'm not going to spend any time going over how to read this and looking at these in any massive detail. If that's something you'd like a video on, then let me know in the comments section below. For now, I just wanted to share these two as the main resources that I'm citing as we're talking around the subject of the meta. And before we get into them any closer, where are you right now? No, I don't mean literally, I mean in terms of 40k. Are you playing narrative games once a month? Or are you attending tournaments every weekend trying to grind out that best performing Deathwatch player in the world? I mean, good luck if that's you, by the way. And while you're there, spare a thought for us poor GSC players paying the price for our early 10th edition sins. In all seriousness, depending on your answer to that question, where you are right now in 40k, this is how much attention you should be paying to the meta. This is the most common pitfall that I've seen, and time again, over the years playing this glorious game. If you're playing just for fun, then this data should just be seen as that. Some fun numbers, interesting tidbits. It's nice to have. This should not be dictating to you how you should be playing the game. If anyone's telling you that's not the correct choice, that's not what you should be doing, you just got to ignore all that noise, let that wash over you. You're playing for the reasons that you're playing, and the metagame information and what's going to be the most hyper-efficient unit or min-maxed composition of units on the battlefield really is not the be-all and end-all. However, if you're trying to improve at 40k, if you're trying to win more events, if you've got a very specific goal in mind about how you're trying to do better with the faction that you're playing, then of course the metagame considerations and that sort of information about what's a more efficient unit becomes more relevant to you. And if that's where you are at 40k at the moment, then absolutely the meta is important. However, this is still something that I would urge caution with, because let's say for example we've got two outliers based on current tournament data in the form of Necrons and Custodes, both with a more than comfortable 50+% win rate. Let's say we've got a faction that doesn't pair very well into either of those two armies. We have a very low win percentage against those factions, and if you go to certain factions and look at the win percentages you can see on the screen here, you can actually compare your army's faction against factions that are doing very well. And let's say we've got a faction that doesn't have a very good win rate into Custodes and Necrons. We could be looking at this data and thinking, oh no, I want to try and do really well at a tournament, yet my faction is currently going to get absolutely smashed against Custodes and Necrons. How on earth am I going to win? I can't win. I've got to change faction. I've got to either play Custodes or Necrons to do well. Let's say we've got a goal to try and do better at tournaments, get a positive win record, or even win an event. How on earth can we do that if we're not playing one of these two good factions? Well, there's so many other things that come into play against not just the numbers on the page. The first and foremost is obviously, and I've talked about it before, just practice with your army. If we're jumping to what we perceive to be a really good winning faction at the moment, then we're having to potentially learn from scratch the nuances and, well, the army for a start. It could be a new faction, and learning the ins and outs of that army. That's a barrier to success in its own right. And if we've got a different faction that we're much more practiced with and we understand, then any sort of advantage we gain from playing a faction that's got a higher win percentage is going to be lost in the fact that we're still potentially going to be learning that faction even as we're playing the games in that event. The Necron Codex, for example, hasn't been out all that long, and if you're someone who's just seeing this decent win rate and thinking, I'm going to get on that and I'm going to do well at tournaments, and just ride that wave until the next faction that has a similar kind of win percentage at the moment does well, then you're going to be setting yourself up for some disappointment. If you dive into an event without as much practice as what your previous faction was, can result in a worse performance than if you're just stuck with your faction and thought about how we can adjust the list based on what we're seeing here. So that's a danger. And when I talk about reacting to things in the meta as well, touched on in the beginning intro of the video how that can itself be a danger, and it definitely can. These might be the two factions with the current highest win percentage, but there's more to the numbers than that. And if we're just attending an RTT or a GT, there is a very real chance that we might not actually play these factions. The first 3, maybe even 4 rounds of a tournament, it's really quite random who we get paired into. Yes, you might play winners. There's a very reasonable chance you'll be paired into a Custodes player round 2, 3. But also the other factions are still winning games. It's just that the win percentage is high. And if you look at the 55% win rate, that still shows the faction loses 45% of the time. So there are other factions that are also in the game, winning the game. So in these tournaments, we are going to play against other factions as well. It's not just going to be Custodes and Necrons that we're facing all the time. So if we're making extreme changes to our lists to absolutely smash Custodes and Necrons, and then find we don't get paired into either of those lists, and then have a tougher time because we've made a weird adjustment to our list that creates a problem somewhere else, it's really, really important not to get too focused, distracted by the metagame and thinking, oh, these factions are broken, I'm going to have to take extreme measures to try and win. Think about the changes that you're making. Are they actually going to benefit you in the long term? Even if you're trying to win a tournament on the horizon very, very shortly, is the decision that you're going to make in response to what you're seeing in win rates, metagame, going on around you in the 40k community, is whatever decision or change you're going to make actually going to benefit you long term? You might perceive there to be benefit having a crack at a tournament. Pinning your hopes on one individual event is a really surefire way to increase burnout. Burnout that can be associated with meta chasing as well. Jumping onto a really powerful faction because you think they're going to win you games. If you're not doing it because you enjoy the faction, you're just chasing the W and you're just thinking about the best possible on paper mathematical chance I've got of winning this game or winning this event, and there's a very real chance you're just going to kind of suck the passion out of this game for yourself. You might not realize it straight away, but if you're just jumping onto factions that have got a strong win rate and you don't really care about how they play, you might discover that you're playing an army that you just really, really hate. You don't have any enjoyment out of it, and that's going to affect how well you do at tournaments. It's going to be a grind and you're going to burn out. You're going to then begin to potentially become disassociated with playing the game. You'll have games where you win, but you almost don't feel anything for it because you're not playing an army you enjoy, so you don't really get any enjoyment out of winning, and then that can lead you to burnout. And then all of a sudden the balanced data slate hits and that faction gets updated, gets toned down a little bit, win percentage starts to trickle back down, and then you're thinking, oh, okay, I don't want to play this faction because it's not winning as much for me anymore, and then you're on to the next faction. And then these peaks and valleys of you trying to learn new factions and jump onto the next hottest thing, you might actually find that over time that this is worsening your overall win percentage yourself as you're jumping from faction to faction, not learning how to use an army particularly well. Maybe there's a small amount of initial success as you go to a tournament. Maybe you go 3-2, 4-1 and you're thinking, great, okay, starting to get the hang of this one. But then something changes and then you're on to something else. You haven't really then been able to leverage that knowledge you've gained from playing that faction and winning with it to then continue that momentum. You're just then off of it and on to the next one, and then having that uphill struggle with another faction of learning that. And long term, that is damaging not only to how well you'll perform in game over time, but also, as I mentioned, the burnout and the fatigue, and just doing that infinitely is really going to destroy the passion for the game and make it so you're just kind of going through the motions and not really enjoying the hobby, which even at the competitive levels of the game is something that cannot be ignored. Are we actually enjoying this? If you're playing competitive lists and playing at the competitive levels with a faction that you really just don't like or enjoy, then what are we really doing? If it's not fun, then you're going to pour all those hours into learning that faction and playing the game and not enjoy it. That just seems mad to me. Absolutely mad. I mean, if there was some sort of cash prize at the end of it, then fair enough, if that's your bag. But that's not the reality, and these things really will, over time, wear down your performance and your win rate. Even if it's not something that's immediately noticeable, it will detract from it. And also with statistics, it's very easy to look at these summaries and extrapolate false information, or even if you don't do it intentionally, you can create a biased view just by looking at only a couple of points in isolation. For example, Deathwatch, Space Marines, they're the two factions with the lowest win percentage at the moment, which means that according to this, we could take away that Space Marines, Deathwatch are the weakest factions. We can see Deathwatch has had a total of 155 games recorded, whereas Space Marines has over 1,600. Space Marines have a larger player base, which could be dragging that win percentage down and not be a true reflection of the power level of the Space Marine faction at all. And also there's different formations within Space Marines, so you've got all the different options within Space Marines adding to those numbers, and so you're not comparing apples and apples, you're comparing apples and oranges, and on paper it looks like Space Marines and Death Watch are at the same sort of power level, but it's only when you start to look a little bit deeper into that you can really start to unpack that and then look which detachment in Space Marines has actually got a lower win percentage than the others. Vanguard Spearhead, straight away, Vanguard Spearhead on its own is higher than Death Watch, and with more games played. So even just a slightly deeper look into that one detachment gives us a much bigger picture than looking at the whole thing and just concluding Space Marines and Death Watch are on the same level. It's just not true. There's a really famous quote, not that I like to make a habit of quoting members of the Tory party, but there was a British politician that once said, "You can prove whatever you want with statistics except the truth," or words to that effect. And that exemplifies exactly what I mean here, looking at the Death Watch Space Marine example, but it's only when you start to then unpack that and change your perspective. So this is what I mean when I say we want to be careful when we're looking at the metagame. Not just look at the snapshot and think, I can make conclusions and I can make decisions in my list based on that. This doesn't take into account nuances within each faction, differences in list, player skill that we want to be thinking about when we're looking at win rates, the metagame, look at statistics, or if we just make knee-jerk reactions, how that can have negative ramifications without us necessarily realising it. These forms of self-sabotage, we don't always realise we're doing it. If you want to hear how not to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, then check out this video where I go through some of the most common ways we accidentally sabotage our own games and how we can get around that to improve as a player and have more rewarding games. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching. Keep rolling those dice and stay tuned for more.